They told us the American frontier was a land of promise, a place where families could carve their futures from wilderness and manifest destiny would crown them with wealth and freedom. But buried beneath that polished lie was a truth so dark that few dared to whisper it, let alone record it. This is not the tale of heroic pioneers. This is the story of the Donner Party men, women, and children who left behind civilization with dreams of California, only to find themselves swallowed by snow, starvation, and a horror that America tried to bury. Picture it, November 1846, the Sierra Nevada, winter storms clawing down from the mountains like the hand of a vengeful god. 87 souls trapped in wooden wagons, oxen dead in the snow, supplies gone, and an invisible clock ticking toward madness. They would do things no man, no woman, no child was ever meant to do. They would eat the dead. And in the silence of those mountains, some whispered they went further, that the line between survival and murder blurred in the shadows. You are about to descend into a forbidden chapter of American history, one that exposes not just the desperation of stranded pioneers, but the corruption of institutions that led them there, the manipulation of guides who sold false promises, and the psychological machinery that drives men to consume both flesh and truth itself. This is not a ghost story, though ghosts walk here. This is not folklore, though legends cling to it. This is documented, recorded, etched into the archives, yet still, the full truth has been kept from you. Because the Donner Party is not just a story of snowbound cannibals, it is a mirror held up to the American dream, showing its rot, its lies, its willingness to sacrifice ordinary families for expansion, power, and control. Once you hear what happened in those mountains, you will never think of history or of hunger the same way again. And as the storm closes in around them, as the snow drifts higher than their cabins, you will hear the whispers that no one was meant to hear. The journey into darkness begins now. The Donner Party did not begin in tragedy. They began like countless others, with hope burning in their chests and wagons creaking under the weight of ambition. In April 1846, families left Springfield, Illinois, chasing the lure of California's gold-stained soil and fertile valleys. They were ordinary Americans, farmers, craftsmen, mothers, fathers, answering the national call to push westward, to manifest destiny. But within that call lay a hidden trap. Expansion was not just about settling land. It was about control, about stretching America's reach into untamed territory at any cost. The emigrant trails were advertised like safe highways, yet they were littered with bones. Into this deception stepped George Donner and James Reed, respected men with confidence enough to lead dozens of souls across plains and mountains. With wives and children in tow, they joined the flow of humanity heading west, following a path that seemed well-worn and promising. But it wasn't enough to simply follow. America thrives on shortcuts, on promises of faster riches, easier paths. And so when the name Lansford Hastings was whispered, man promoting a new route called the Hastings Cutoff, the seed of ruin was planted. Hastings promised a shorter trail to California, a way to shave weeks off the journey. But he had never led a full wagon party across it. He had never tested its dangers. He was selling a dream, and men desperate for advantage bought it. The Donner Party, trusting words over wisdom, chose that path. In that decision, their fates were sealed. This was not chance, not random misfortune, but the collision of human greed and blind faith in authority. Families were led into the jaws of deserts, mountains, and time itself, until hope rotted into despair. In April, when they left Illinois, they laughed around fires and sang songs of courage. By November, many would lie frozen, their bodies gnawed by the very people they loved. Between those months lay the anatomy of deception, of choices made in good faith, but poisoned by lies. The American frontier, we are told, was built by brave families seeking opportunity. But beneath the textbooks, hidden between the lines, is a deeper truth. It was built on manipulation, on pushing ordinary men and women into battles with nature they could not win. The Donner Party was not the first to be sacrificed to expansion. They would become the most unforgettable. The first cracks in the dream appeared long before the snow. When the Donner Party reached Fort Bridger in July 1846, they stood at a fork in their destiny. Hastings's shortcut promised to save them time, but reality was already whispering its warnings. Other emigrants who had attempted the route had left traces of disaster-broken wagons, dying oxen, whispers of hellish terrain. Yet the owners of Fort Bridger, Jim Bridger, and Louis Vasquez hid those warnings. They had a stake in steering travelers onto Hastings's path, for each wagon meant profit, and each family meant coin. They concealed letters of caution, testimonies from earlier groups that screamed, "Do not go." They looked into the eyes of men, women, and children and sent them into the maw of mountains and deserts with full knowledge that many would not emerge. This is not simply misfortune. This is institutional betrayal. The westward expansion machine thrived on bodies. Government, merchants, guides all understood that the risk fell not on them but on families who would break or vanish under the weight of their deception. And so the Donners and Reeds pressed forward into the Wasatch Mountains, hacking through uncut wilderness, losing precious weeks. Wagons shattered against rock, oxen collapsed in exhaustion, and still they pushed on, believing that endurance would buy them salvation. But endurance without truth is a curse. Each day their supplies thinned, their children cried, and the once bright road to California began to look like a corridor to death. Then came the Great Salt Lake Desert, a stretch Hastings had assured them would take 2 days to cross. It took 6. 6 days of blistering sun, endless salt crust, tearing hooves and feet, mirages shimmering like promises just out of reach. Their oxen screamed and fell. Wagons were abandoned, belongings scattered across the barren white like offerings to a god of desolation. By the time they emerged, they had lost time, strength, and faith. Each mile now was heavier, their eyes haunted by the realization that the shortcut was no gift but a curse. And yet they marched on, unaware that winter was racing to meet them, that the very mountains ahead were sharpening their teeth for the feast to come. The snow had not yet fallen, but the trap was already sprung. They were walking into it with open eyes, guided by lies that wore the mask of authority. And the clock ticked louder with every wasted step by the time the battered wagons crawled out of the Salt Lake Desert. The Donner Party was no longer a unified caravan of hopeful families, but a scattered procession of ghosts in the making. Tempers cracked, alliances fractured, and hunger etched itself into every face. The shortcut had robbed them not only of time, but of trust. Children were thinner, oxen scarcer, and the once steady rhythm of wagon wheels was broken by arguments, cries, and silences that carried more dread than words. It was here that leadership splintered. George Donner, though respected, was aging and slow, his judgment dulled by exhaustion. James Reed, strong-willed and ambitious, had clashed with men who saw his authority as arrogance. A fight turned fatal, and Reed was banished from the company, forced to ride ahead with little more than his family. Stripped of unity, the group staggered westward, bleeding strength with each mile. Still, California dangled before them like a mirage, an imagined paradise where their suffering would be redeemed. Yet even as they limped toward it, the Sierra Nevada rose on the horizon, jagged and indifferent, already cloaked in the threat of snow. It was early October, and they had been meant to cross long before, each delay there hacking through Wassa canyons. The endless march across salt had brought them closer to winter's jaws. And the mountains are merciless to the unprepared. Few pioneers understood the brutality of Sierra storms, how quickly skies could turn from blue to blizzard, how snow could fall not in inches but in feet, burying trails and wagons alike. Those who did know had warned them, but warnings had been buried under the weight of Hastings's lies and Bridger's profits. Now the Donners and Reeds marched into fate with dwindling food, broken wagons, and the gnawing awareness that the season was turning against them. By the Truckee River they paused, sensing the danger ahead but too deep into the journey to turn. Back, behind them, lay deserts of salt and regret. Before them stood walls of granite, soon to be draped in white shrouds. No choice remained but forward. Yet every pioneer who has ever walked west knows one truth. Nature does not forgive delays. As they lit fires by the river and whispered of the pass ahead, the first storm was already gathering in the high peaks, a silent avalanche of inevitability waiting to fall. They were days, perhaps hours, from being sealed in, and still they marched. The first flakes fell like warnings from the sky, soft and almost beautiful, but beauty is the mask of death in the high Sierra. As the Donner Party pressed toward the summit, snow came heavy and sudden, burying the trail, turning the mountains into a white labyrinth where every step demanded the strength they no longer possessed. Wagons lurched in drifts, oxen collapsed beneath the weight, and men strained to clear paths, only to watch the storm erase them in moments. They had gambled on outrunning winter, and winter had won. The pass, their final gateway to salvation, closed before their eyes under walls of snow too deep to cross. With nowhere to go, they turned back to the lakeside, defeated, their dreams of California now trapped on the other side of a frozen wall. It was November 1846, and the mountains had claimed them. The decision was made to build shelter at Truckee. Lake and Alder Creek, rough cabins hacked from timber, walls barely holding back the wind, families huddled together in darkness, the air thick with fear, the firewood dwindling as quickly as the food. At first, they rationed what little remained. Scraps of flour, meager portions of rice, the stringy flesh of oxen already dead from exhaustion. When that was gone, they boiled hides, chewed on leather, gnawed on twigs to quiet the screams of hunger in their bellies. Snow fell and fell, piling higher, sealing the cabins in like tombs. The mountains did not care for their tears, their prayers, their children crying in the night. Each day became a battle not to live, but not to die yet. The younger ones whimpered in their mothers' arms. The older children stared into flames, with hollow eyes, and men who had once dreamed of land and fortune now dreamed only of bread. And beneath that hunger, something darker stirred. They whispered it at first, in fear as much as temptation. But the longer the snow held them prisoner, the clearer it became. They would eat what remained. They would eat the dead. And once that line was crossed, the Sierra would hold them in chains of blood and shame forever. This was not just starvation. This was descent. Death came quietly at first, as if testing their resolve. The weakest, the youngest, the The oldest, those who could not endure the hunger and the cold, slipped away one by one. Bodies lay beneath blankets of snow or hidden in corners of the cabins, frozen in positions that spoke of agony and surrender. For days, the living tried to keep the boundary sacred, burying their dead or keeping them apart, whispering prayers as though faith alone might deliver food from the storm. But faith does not fill a stomach, and prayers cannot warm children shivering on the edge of death. Hunger is a language older than morality, and it speaks with a voice that drowns out law, religion, and shame. They began with hides and leather, boiling strips of ox skin until it softened into something barely chewable, swallowing it with grim determination while the body demanded more. But soon even the leather was gone, and what remained was flesh human. Flesh, the unthinkable turned inevitable. The first decision to cut into a frozen corpse was not made with words, but with silence. A silence so heavy it could crush the soul. Mothers looked at their starving children. Fathers watched their sons weaken, and the line between decency and survival blurred under the weight of necessity. A body was no longer a body. It was meat, sustenance, the only thing standing between the living and the grave. And once that line was crossed, there was no going back. Each meal carried guilt, horror, and relief in equal measure. Some claimed they refused, clinging to scraps of integrity even as their families starved. But the truth is harder to pin down. Historians debate, survivors denied, and yet the evidence in diaries and testimonies reveals the terrible reality. The dead became the food of the living. And as the blizzards raged outside, inside the cabins of Truckee Lake and Alder Creek, the pioneers became shadows of themselves, caught between desperation and damnation. What is more disturbing than the act itself is what it reveals, how quickly civilization collapses when hunger takes command. These were not criminals, not savages, they were ordinary families, reshaped by starvation into something America did not want to acknowledge. In their silence, in their shame, they reflected a truth the frontier tried to bury. When men are stripped of choice, morality becomes another corpse waiting to be consumed. By December, the camps were no longer places of waiting, but prisons of ice, and hope was as scarce as food. The snow lay deeper than any man could remember, rising higher than the cabins, sealing the families in as though the mountain itself had buried them alive. Children cried with voices so thin they barely carried beyond the walls, and parents could not bear to watch them waste away. So a decision was made. A group would try to cross the mountains on foot and bring back help. 17 souls volunteered for the march, chosen for strength, desperation, and sheer will to survive. They called themselves the Forlorn Hope, a name that carried both defiance and prophecy. They fashioned crude snowshoes from ox bows and rawhide, packed what little scraps of food they could gather, and stepped into the white abyss with nothing but faith that California lay somewhere beyond the horizon. Each day was a torment of blinding snow, freezing wind, and the endless weight of hunger. Their progress was slow, each mile carved out by agony, their bodies sinking waist-deep into drifts. The sun offered no warmth, the stars no comfort. Nights were a theatre of screams as frostbite chewed through flesh, as hunger carved at their sanity. One by one, strength failed. The desert had already taken their oxen, the mountains their wagons, and now the snow claimed their companions. Death walked beside them, and when it finally reached into their circle, the choice returned: die with the dead, or live with the unthinkable. They cut strips of flesh from frozen bodies, shared them in silence, each bite a betrayal of who they once were, yet without it, they would not take another step. The forlorn hope was more than a march, it was a crucifixion. Men and women stumbled through the blizzards, carrying not only the weight of starvation but the knowledge of what they had become. And when two Miwok guides who had tried to help them could go no further, the desperation of some members crossed an even darker line. Shots were fired, and the guides fell, not by nature's hand, but by human hunger. Their bodies became food, and with that act the group bound itself to a fate beyond forgiveness. Still, they pressed forward, gaunt shadows of pioneers, walking deeper into death, yet refusing to fall. Because to stop was to freeze, and to freeze was to be eaten by those still walking. When the survivors of the forlorn hope finally stumbled out of the Sierra wilderness, they were no longer recognizable as men and women who had once set out in wagons filled with dreams. They were skeletal, frostbitten, their eyes hollowed by horrors they could not speak aloud. They had marched for weeks, shedding companions like leaves in winter, until only 7 remained to stagger into the valley below. The sight of them horrified those who found them living shadows draped in rags, walking testaments to human endurance and human corruption. Whispers spread quickly, carried faster than the survivors themselves could move. These people had eaten the dead. California's settlements, still fragile in their own existence, shuddered at the news. Some dismissed the stories as exaggeration, the kind of macabre rumor that frontier life bred. But those who looked into the eyes of the forlorn hope knew the truth. In their silence, in their trembling hands, in the stains of their journey, the evidence was undeniable. Yet beyond the scandal of cannibalism lay a more urgent reality. The families were still trapped in the mountains, buried under snow, dying a little more with each passing hour. The survivors begged for help, but help was not easily given. The settlements were small, resources thin, and the thought of sending men into the deadly snows was a death sentence in itself. Weeks passed as plans were drawn, supplies gathered, and volunteers recruited. Meanwhile, in the cabins by Truckee Lake and Alder Creek, hunger deepened into something monstrous. Families burned furniture for fire, boiled bones until nothing remained, watched their children wither into silence. Some died in their mother's arms, some slipped away in sleep, some stared into the storm and simply stopped breathing. And each death became another decision. Would the body be buried or consumed? To refuse meant starvation. To accept meant survival at the cost of humanity. Those who survived the forlorn hope had already crossed that line, and now their loved ones back in the mountains were being driven to the same threshold. The outside world knew at last that the Donner Party was not lost, but trapped. And as rescue parties began to organize, they carried not only blankets and food, but questions. Darker than the storm itself. Would anyone still be alive when they arrived? And if so, what would those survivors have done to endure? When the first relief party reached Truckee Lake in February of 1847, they expected suffering, but nothing could prepare them for what their eyes met as the snow parted to reveal the cabins. The place had ceased to look like a settlement of families, and had instead transformed into something closer to a frozen tomb. Smoke drifted weakly from broken chimneys, the stench of death carried even in the cold air. They stepped into the cabins and saw the faces of the living gaunt, skeletal, there. Eyes wide and unblinking, the spark of civilization extinguished. Mothers clutching lifeless infants, children too weak to rise from the floor, men sitting silent like shadows carved from ice, bones cracked in the corner, fires, boiled hides hung from rafters, scraps of flesh simmered in blackened pots. The Rescuers recoiled, but they could not turn away, for these were not monsters, but human beings, driven past the edge of sanity by hunger, cold, and despair. They offered food, but the survivors ate with such frenzy that some fell ill, choking on. Salvation, relief, was not a clean deliverance. It was another layer of torment. The rescuers counted the dead and the living, but the line between them seemed blurred. Some lay so still they were thought corpses until they moved. Others had passed on days earlier, yet their bodies remained in the corners, not yet buried, not yet untouched. When asked what had happened, no one spoke directly. Some muttered prayers, some averted their gaze, some simply whispered, "We did what we had to." For the rescuers, it was like stepping into a nightmare that had been waiting behind the walls of silence. But the truth was worse still. The journey out would claim more lives. Those too weak to walk could not all be carried, and children clung. 2 rescuers who knew not all of them could be saved. The decision of who lived and who was left behind became the cruelest burden. The first relief party could only take a fraction, leaving others with promises that more help would come. As they departed, the cries of the abandoned echoed across the snow, haunting every man who heard them. In that moment, the rescuers understood the truth. What they were saving was not merely lives, but witnesses to a darkness so deep that the very soil of America would forever be stained by it. By the time the second relief party forced its way through the crushing Sierra snows in March, the cabins at Truckee Lake had sunk deeper into a silence that felt less like survival and more like a graveyard. What the rescuers encountered was not the frantic desperation of the first contact, but something colder, more resigned, as though the people inside had already crossed into another world. The survivors no longer looked upon the rescuers with shock or pleading. They stared with hollow eyes that spoke of bargains already made. The smell inside the cabins had grown worse, a heavy rot mingling with the acrid smoke of burned hides. In corners, pieces of human remains lay stacked with grim practicality, stripped to bone, roasted, boiled, consumed without ceremony. The rescuers turned their faces away, but the evidence was impossible to ignore. Those who remained alive admitted little, but the truth bled through their silence. The flesh of fathers, mothers, siblings, and neighbors had become their final meal. Some survivors recoiled at what they had done, choking on shame, while others had entered a kind of numb acceptance. The second relief party faced the same impossible choice as the first: whom to save, whom to leave, whom to condemn to the storm. Children begged not to be left behind, clutching the hands of rescuers who knew their arms could not carry all of them. Men who had been leaders of families now wept like broken children themselves, begging for deliverance or death. Among the rescuers, whispers began. What if those left behind were not just dying, but being hunted, one, by those who remained? The lines between survival, crime, and horror blurred until there was no distinction. Some survivors confessed that death had not always been natural, that hunger had sharpened into violence, that men like Luis and Salvador, the Miwok guides, who had given their strength to lead the group, had been murdered for meat. This revelation fell like a curse upon the camp, confirming that the storm had not only broken bodies, but corrupted souls. The second relief party could take more out of the mountains, but still not all. And when they turned back, carrying souls stumbling toward the valleys, the cabins at Truckee Lake remained filled with those too weak, too resigned, or too tainted to leave. With each departure, the survivors left behind knew the odds of their salvation withered. What remained was hunger, madness, and the slow erasure of human dignity. By April, when the third relief party forced their way back into the mountains, the storm-buried wilderness had turned from a prison into something resembling an ossuary, a landscape where the snow itself seemed to hold memory of suffering. The rescuers who pushed onward were hardened men, yet even they faltered at what they found when they reached the camps. At Alder Creek, where the Donner family had remained, tents of rawhide sagged under the weight of snow and despair. Inside, gaunt survivors whispered from lips too cracked to bleed, their skeletal hands gesturing weakly toward what remained of their life. But the larder was no longer food in the traditional sense, was carved flesh, dried sinew, bone gnawed, until marrow had been sucked away. At Truckee Lake, the sight was darker still. What had once been a community had become a chamber of the macabre. Half buried in snowbanks outside the cabins were human remains, frozen in grotesque positions, some half dismembered, others bearing the unmistakable cuts of knives. Within the huts, the rescuers found children alive, but their eyes spoke of unspeakable things they had witnessed, things no child should ever have to see. Some clutched at the rescuers with desperation, as if fearing that at any moment they, too, would be reduced to sustenance. The rescuers counted survivors, but they also counted the dead, and the numbers told a story more chilling than words could. Entire families had vanished, their names destined to survive only in whispered testimony of consumption. One cabin seemed abandoned until the rescuers forced the door and discovered a woman crouched in the corner, chewing quietly on a strip of leather, but surrounded by butchered remains. She spoke calmly, without shame, as though the line between food and kin had ceased to exist weeks before. Even the rescuers, who had known the mission would expose them to horror, recoiled in silence. Some whispered of curses, of the mountains themselves taking vengeance, of a moral test engineered by forces beyond human comprehension. For the third relief, the decision was merciless, but necessary. They would remove only those who still had the strength to survive the descent. The others, too weak or too broken, would be left once more in the nightmare they had built, surrounded by the shadows of their choices. And with every step back down the frozen trails, the rescuers carried not only the living, but the unbearable knowledge that America's dream of expansion had given birth to a story of cannibalism, betrayal, and humanity stripped to its core. When the fourth and final relief pushed through the thawing snow in April 1847, what they discovered was less a camp of survivors than a place of ruin, a hollow echo of what had once been families and travelers filled with hope. The mountains had begun to loosen their grip, the ice receding into rivers of meltwater. But what was revealed beneath was no resurrection, no only evidence of the nightmare that had unfolded unchecked for months. At Truckee Lake, just a handful remained alive. They sat among piles of bones, the cabins now more morgues than shelters, the air heavy with the metallic scent of decay. Some of the survivors were skeletal children who looked more like specters than the living, their limbs stick-thin, their eyes vast and hollow. Around them, the bodies of their kin lay butchered, stacked with grim precision, the humanity stripped away as if they had been livestock instead of people. At Alder Creek, the rescuers found Louis Kesselberg, a man who would forever be remembered with suspicion. He was discovered alive, but in the cabin around him lay human remains. When asked how he had survived, he admitted without hesitation that he had consumed flesh. But there were whispers: too many bones missing, too much flesh carved away for one man to have needed. Some suspected he had killed the weak deliberately, prolonging his survival not through chance but through calculated murder. Keseberg denied it, but his name became a stain, a symbol of what men become when society is stripped from them. The rescuers gathered the last of the living and descended the mountain for the final time, carrying with them the scars of what they had seen. By the end of the 87 who had set out in 1846, only 48 survived. Families had been erased, bloodlines broken, and reputations destroyed. Yet when news of their ordeal spread through the settlements, the reactions were not sympathy alone. Some whispered of curses, of divine punishment for arrogance, for taking the path through the mountains to late in the season. Others pointed to the corruption of leadership, to Lansford Hastings, who had promised an easy route and abandoned them to fate, to the institutions of expansion and greed that had demanded ordinary families risk their lives in the name of manifest destiny. The story of the Donner Party became more than tragedy. It became a mirror. It showed that beneath the thin surface of civilization, in the face of starvation and betrayal, America itself was capable of consuming its own. When the survivors of the Donner Party staggered into the settlements of California, their appearance was more ghost than human. Skin stretched thin over bone, eyes haunted, movements unsteady, they carried with them not only their own bodies, but the weight of the unspeakable. Whispers spread faster than their steps. Cannibalism, children eating their parents, neighbors feeding upon neighbors. The American frontier, which had been sold as a dream of prosperity and fertile lands, suddenly had a shadow darker than any settler wanted to admit. Newspapers seized upon the story, branding it with horror, framing the tale not just as misfortune, but as spectacle. For many, the Donner name became synonymous with savagery, as though what happened in the Sierra Nevada was proof that civilization could collapse overnight. Yet for the survivors, the punishment did not end when the snow melted. They were met with stares, with judgment, with questions whispered behind closed doors. Were they heroes of endurance or abominations who had broken the final taboo? For some, the answer was survival at any cost, but for others, the shame followed them like a shadow until death. Families who had once been respected in their communities now carried scars no one could cleanse. Children grew up under the mark of accusation, their lives defined not by their own deeds but by what their parents had been forced to do. And then there was Louis Keseberg, the man most burdened by suspicion. Tales spread that he had not only eaten the dead but murdered the living to prolong his survival. He became a pariah, cursed in print and in rumor, a walking reminder of what men were capable of when stripped of law, of morality, of witnesses. Yet, if society judged him, it was also complicit in creating him. It was not just the storms that trapped the Donner Party, it was false promises from guides seeking profit, corrupt expansionist propaganda that told families the land was waiting, and institutions that abandoned them once they became inconvenient. In the broader shadow, the Donner story was not merely one of cannibalism, but of America itself consuming its own citizens in the name of progress. Survivors lived with this paradox. They were both victims and symbols, their suffering transformed into cautionary tale, their names twisted into legend. And beneath it all, the deeper truth lingered: civilization's mask is fragile, and when it cracks, the beast beneath is never far away. The Donner Party's suffering did not end in the mountains, nor did it end when they stumbled into settlements, broken and skeletal. What followed was something more insidious, the rewriting of their story by institutions that saw opportunity in horror. Newspapers, desperate for circulation, painted the tragedy in lurid detail, feeding readers a mix of fact, rumor, and exaggeration. Editors knew the taboo of cannibalism would ignite fascination, and so they branded the survivors not only as desperate wanderers, but as monsters. Louis Kesselberg, in particular, was transformed into the villain of the tale, accused in print of murder, accused of ghoulish delights, accused of feeding not only for survival, but for pleasure. Whether true or not ceased to matter. The narrative served the appetite of the public and the profit of the press. Yet beneath the sensationalism lay something deeper. The very institutions that had pushed families, westward land speculators, political propagandists, and figures like Lansford Hastings needed the tragedy to be redefined. They could not afford the Donner Party to be remembered as victims of false promises, reckless guidance, and systemic greed. Instead, they were cast as cautionary figures, their deaths blamed on poor decisions, bad timing, and the moral weakness of individuals. The corruption of leadership and the lies of expansion were buried under the spectacle of cannibalism. In this way, the Donner Party was weaponized as propaganda, not to warn against the dangers of westward expansion, but to justify stronger discipline, harsher rules, and unquestioning obedience to authority. The settlers who followed were told, not that the dream was poisoned, but that it demanded stricter order, unquestioned loyalty to trail guides, to institutions, to the machinery of manifest destiny. The blood and bones in the Sierra Nevada were transmuted into a tool of control. Their suffering converted into a morality play designed to terrify the weak and shape the will of the strong. Even survivors were coerced into silence, their voices drowned out by narratives that suited political ambition. The truth was scattered, suppressed, or reconfigured to suit power, and what remained was myth. A tale of savagery on the frontier, a reminder to the public that without authority and obedience, men would eat each other alive. The real crime was not just what happened in the cabins of snow, but how it was twisted, concealed, and sold back to a nation hungry for both land and order. For the survivors of the Donner Party, life after rescue was no true deliverance. Though they had escaped the snow, they found themselves imprisoned in another kind of torment, the chains of memory and the stigma of judgment. Every whispered rumor, every headline, every stare in the marketplace reminded them that their names had been etched into America's consciousness, not as pioneers, but as cannibals. Some children, too young to remember, grew up haunted not by their own actions, but by the shadows of what others believed their parents had done. They were pointed at, mocked, shunned, their identities consumed by a story they could not control. Women who had once been mothers and wives returned to a society that measured their survival against the bones of those who had perished. Did they mourn enough? Did they resist enough? Did they cross the line willingly? Or were they dragged across it by hunger? Men who had once been respected leaders now carried the unbearable weight of failure, accused not only of weakness, but of abandoning morality itself. The psychological torment was relentless, and silence became both weapon and refuge. Survivors rarely spoke of the mountains, not because they had forgotten, but because the act of remembering reopened wounds that never closed. And in their silence, others spoke for them: journalists, opportunists, politicians, all reshaping their suffering into narratives of warning, obedience, and submission. The survivors were stripped of control, not only over their circumstances in the snow, but over their story afterward. This was not simply personal shame. It was a method of social control. By branding them as outcasts, society created an example, a warning that those who challenged the ordained systems of authorities, who trusted false guides, Those who left the path to late would not only perish, but become monsters in memory. It was a form of psychological policing, a reminder that even survival was not freedom if one stepped outside the sanctioned order. The scars of the Donner Party ran deeper than hunger. They carved into the mind, shaping lives long after the snow melted. Guilt became hereditary, shame became inheritance, and silence became survival in a world that demanded obedience to the narrative written by power. Their story was never theirs, it was seized, twisted, and used as proof that without submission to authority, humanity itself collapses into chaos and blood. The Donner Party's suffering did not exist in isolation. It was part of a much larger story, one that revealed the hidden machinery driving America's westward expansion. To the settlers who followed, the Sierra Nevada was painted as a challenge to be conquered, a proving ground for strength, obedience, and faith in the destiny of the nation. But beneath that noble facade lay corruption and greed, forces that profited from every life risked on the trail. The false promises of Lansford Hastings were not the blunders of one misguided man. They were symptomatic of a system that thrived on illusion. His shortcut through the wilderness was sold as opportunity, but in reality it was an experiment conducted with human lives, a gamble designed to attract more settlers, more land, claims, more power for those who stood to gain from the colonization of the West. The Donners and Reeds became pawns in this great design, their blood feeding a narrative that others would later bend to their will. The institutions behind manifest. Destiny understood the power of story. They needed triumphs to glorify, and they needed tragedies to manipulate. The Donner Party became both. Their agony was turned into a tale of disobedience, used to warn settlers against independent thinking, against questioning authority, against straying from the prescribed path. They were told that only through obedience to sanctioned leaders, sanctioned routes, sanctioned systems, could one survive. In this way, the dead in the mountains served the expansion not by stopping it, but by strengthening its grip. The lesson carved into the flesh of the Donners was not that manifest destiny was reckless, but that manifest destiny demanded stricter control. Those who survived became unwilling martyrs, their names invoked not to honor them, but to enforce compliance. And still, the deeper truth was buried. Behind the propaganda, the real crime was clear. Families had been sacrificed on the altar of ambition, their trust exploited by men who viewed them not as souls, but as instruments for conquest. In the story of the Donner Party, America revealed its darker face, that progress was not built on dreams, but on corpses, that destiny was not divine, but manufactured, and that beneath every great expansion lay bones no one wanted to count. The hidden agenda was not survival, it was control, and the Donners were its unwilling witnesses. Starvation is not merely a physical assault, it is a psychological weapon, stripping layer after layer of identity until only the rawest instincts remain. In the cabins at Truckee Lake and the tents at Alder Creek, the Donner Party became unwilling participants in a forbidden experiment. What happens when human beings are driven past the boundaries of morality, faith, and self? At first, they resisted, clinging to the rituals of civilization, prayers, meager rations, stories whispered by firelight to calm terrified children. But as the weeks bled into months, the storm did more than bury their shelters in snow. It buried their humanity. Each day brought a deeper descent into a mental labyrinth, where choices were reduced to brutal equations: consume or die, betray or be betrayed, kill or be killed. Hunger gnawed at the mind as much as the body. Men, once proud and rational, became suspicious, paranoid, convinced that others were hoarding scraps or plotting to sacrifice them. Women, once nurturers, now found themselves calculating which corpse might last longest. Children, robbed of innocence, learned too quickly the meaning of survival in its most brutal form. The act of consuming flesh, at first resisted, became normalized, then ritualized. Some did it in silence, hiding the evidence, while others justified it openly, declaring that the dead had given themselves as offerings. Each bite was a step further into the abyss, and once crossed, the path back to humanity grew thinner, almost impossible. This was not madness in the ordinary sense, but a controlled unraveling, the storm and hunger working together as instruments of domination. In truth, what unfolded in those cabins was not just desperation, was psychological control, engineered, not by a single mastermind, but by the forces that abandoned them, by the institutions that created conditions where desperation became law. The Donner Party became proof that civilization is a mask that slips easily, that the thin thread holding morality together can be cut by hunger in a matter of weeks. And yet, the survivors carried those scars forever, forced to walk among the living while haunted by the knowledge of what they had done and what it revealed about the human mind. The true terror was not that they had consumed flesh, but that, in doing so, they discovered how fragile the boundary between man and beast truly is. The Donner Party was not only a tragedy of survival, but a mirror, and what it reflected back was too dangerous for most to acknowledge. On the surface, it was the tale of a group of pioneers undone by bad timing and a brutal winter. But beneath, it became something far darker, the symbolic revelation of a nation devouring itself. Cannibalism was the literal crime of the mountains, but metaphorically, it was the crime of America consuming families in the name of expansion, feeding on its own people to fuel the machinery of empire. Every hacked bone in the snow was a ledger, entry in the cost of manifest destiny. Every child lost was a tithe to ambition. The Donner Party were not merely victims of storms. They were victims of a culture that promised salvation while demanding sacrifice. Their story was buried beneath headlines and twisted into cautionary myths, but its symbolic truth remained festering. What happened in those cabins was not just the breakdown of morality, but the exposure of America's secret hunger, its willingness to consume its own flesh in pursuit of land, power, and destiny. The families became offerings, not to God, but to the invisible hand of empire, a reminder that conquest has always required corpses. And yet the institutions controlling the narrative could not allow this interpretation to take root. They needed the Donners to be remembered as individuals who failed, not as proof of systemic betrayal. They needed cannibalism to be framed as aberration, not as reflection. But those who look deeper see the pattern. The hunger that stripped the Donners of humanity was the same hunger that stripped indigenous people of their land, the same hunger that sent families into deserts and mountains unprepared, the same hunger that chewed through bodies and futures in the name of progress. To speak the truth of the Donner Party is to speak the truth of America's shadow, that beneath the rhetoric of opportunity lies a cycle of consumption, where those at the bottom are devoured so that the powerful can advance. The bones in the snow were not just relics of a single winter, they were warnings, markers of a pattern that would repeat again and again across the frontier. The Donner Party became myth, yes, but more than that. They became symbol, a nation's reflection of its darkest appetite. Dressed up as destiny, history tells us the Donner Party was an accident, a miscalculation, an unfortunate collision of timing, weather, and human error. But that explanation is too neat, too convenient, and too forgiving of the systems that pushed them west in the first place. These pioneers were not simply chasing dreams. They were responding to propaganda, to the carefully orchestrated lure of manifest destiny. Books like Hastings' Guide were sold not as neutral advice, but as weapons tools meant to channel desperate families into dangerous paths, sacrifices to the machine of expansion. When Hastings promised a shorter route, when Bridger concealed warnings, when Reed insisted on pushing forward, these were not isolated acts of error, but symptoms of a deeper design. The institutions of the time needed bodies to push westward, needed settlers to claim land quickly, regardless of the cost. And so the Donners became pawns in a larger strategy. The fact that they were led into disaster was not simply misfortune, but part of a pattern, promises of freedom leading to chains, promises of opportunity leading to graves. And in that snowy mountain prison, where flesh became the only food, we see the perfect image of systemic betrayals, citizens fed into the jaws of empire, and then abandoned to die. The survivors carried the memory like a curse, while the world that had enticed them west washed its hands of guilt. It is no accident that the Donner Party remains one of America's most haunting stories, because it touches a nerve we cannot numb, the awareness that the powerful have always been willing to feed on the powerless. The bones in the snow did not just speak of hunger, they whispered of design. Every institution involved, from the publishing houses that spread false guides, to the trading posts that concealed letters, to the governments that preached destiny, while offering no aid, played its part in ensuring that ordinary men, women, and children were left to starve. And yet, even in their destruction, the Donners revealed something dangerous. The truth that beneath the gilded promises of progress, there is always a hidden hunger, and that hunger consumes those who trust too deeply. When we examine the Donner Party's descent into cannibalism, we are not only looking at human desperation, but at something far more disturbing: the way systems break the human mind until the unthinkable becomes acceptable. At first, the pioneers resisted the idea of eating their dead. They whispered of it, shamed it, recoiled from it. But as hunger gnawed at their stomachs, as snow walls pressed them in, the forbidden thought returned again and again, until it was no longer monstrous but necessary. This is how control systems work. Strip away resources, isolate individuals, drive them into corners where choices vanish, until the act once seen as impossible becomes survival. The Donner cabins were not just shelters of desperation, they were laboratories of psychological collapse. Every cry of a starving child, every corpse that stiffened in the snow, was another push against the fragile wall of morality. And when the wall cracked, when the first body was carved and consumed, the unthinkable became routine. Here lies the forbidden truth. The Donner Party is a case study in how humans are conditioned to normalize horror. The same mechanisms that made them accept cannibalism are the same mechanisms used by empires, by governments, by institutions of control. Starve the people, strip them of alternatives, bury them in fear, and they will accept what once repulsed them. They will turn against their neighbors. They will betray their values. They will consume the flesh of their own just to survive another day. The mountains created the conditions, but the pattern is universal. Look to history and you will see it repeated. Societies driven to madness by engineered scarcity. Nations pushed into wars they did not want. Populations convinced to surrender freedoms in exchange for the illusion of safety. The Donner cabins were small-scale models of global manipulation, and the lesson they hold is not about hunger, is about control. Once you understand this, you see why their story has been buried under layers of myth. To remember the Donners as mere victims of weather is safe. To recognize them as proof of how easily men can be broken and remade into creatures of obedience, that is dangerous knowledge. Knowledge that once learned cannot be forgotten. After the rescue parties emerged from the snow with half-dead survivors, America faced a choice: how to frame the Donner story. They could have exposed it as the natural consequence of reckless expansionism, the proof that manifest destiny was a death march built on lies. But that truth was too dangerous. Instead, the institutions that recorded the tale reshaped it into a moral parable, a warning dressed in sensationalism. Newspapers painted the Donners as tragic victims, yes, but also as cautionary figures for those who dared to stray from the ordained path. Cannibalism became the headline, the shock, the lurid detail, but its deeper symbolism was concealed. Rather than admit that the hunger came from systemic betrayal, they sold it as the price of poor decisions, the punishment for arrogance, the wages of disobedience. This is how fear becomes a tool. The story was weaponized to keep people in line. Follow the safe path, trust the established routes, do not question the guides, and you might live. Step outside, think for yourself, doubt the voices of authority, and you will be devoured. The Donner Party became propaganda, their bones transmuted into warnings that shackled the imagination of future pioneers. This is why the story lingers. It was never just a tale of hunger, it was a coded lesson in obedience. The same government that allowed families to perish in the snow now used their corpses as sermons, reminding settlers to conform. And yet, even in that controlled narrative, fragments of forbidden truth leaked through. Survivors spoke in whispers of betrayal, of guides who lied, of institutions that abandoned them. Their words were inconvenient, so they were drowned out by louder tales of gore and desperation. But for those who know how to listen, the whispers remain. They tell us that the real crime was not cannibalism, was the deliberate manipulation of men and women into conditions where cannibalism became possible. That truth was too dangerous to admit, so the institutions buried it under the very horror that should have exposed them. The Donner Party were not just victims of snow and hunger. They were casualties of a psychological war, their suffering recycled into lessons of obedience that echoed across generations. Survival did not free the Donner Party, had condemned them. Those who walked out of the Sierra Nevada carried more than scars on their bodies. They carried the weight of silence, a burden engineered by the very society that had abandoned them. The whispers followed them everywhere: cannibals, monsters in human skin. Their names were poisoned, their reputations shackled. The truth was not that they were murderers, but that they had been broken by forces far greater than themselves. Yet the guilt was internalized, twisted into shame so deep that some survivors never spoke of it again. This was psychological control. At its purest, trap a man in a situation engineered to destroy him, then shame him for the way he survives. The result is obedience without chains, silence without laws. Families who had done nothing but cling to life found themselves branded with a stigma that could never be washed away. Mothers avoided questions, fathers looked down in shame, children grew into adults who carried the unspoken terror of being judged for what their parents had done. And in that silence, the system won. The institution that abandoned them did not need to silence them directly. Their own guilt became the gag. Here lies the hidden machinery of power. It is not enough to kill bodies. One must also imprison memories. Survivors were haunted by the voices of the dead they consumed, but they were also haunted by society's watchful eye. Any attempt to speak of betrayal, of institutional failure, of how they were left to die, was drowned by the louder accusation, "You ate human flesh." This weaponized shame erased the larger crime and ensured obedience. Men who might have become critics of power instead became prisoners of their own trauma. And what better way to hide a dark truth than to make its witnesses too ashamed to tell? The mountains did not end when they escaped the snow. The mountains followed them home, looming in every stare, every whisper, every shadow of judgment. The Donner Party never truly escaped, because their survival was not theirs, belonged to the narrative built around them, a narrative designed to suppress the dangerous truth of abandonment and control. Once the blood and snow had faded, once the last survivors tried to return to ordinary lives, America began the process of myth. The Donner Party was not remembered as victims of political greed, institutional neglect, or systemic betrayal. It was remembered as a ghost story. Teachers told it to children as a warning of arrogance. Tavern keepers whispered it by firelight to thrill drunk travelers. Newspapers recounted it with lurid exaggeration, painting the Sierra Nevada as a theater of human monstrosity. In this retelling, the truth was stripped away. The complexity of betrayal, the fact that wealthy expansionists pushed these families west without care for their survival, vanished. What remained was a simple morality play. Men and women dared to defy, and the wilderness punished them. Cannibalism became the centerpiece, not because it revealed anything about human endurance, but because it distracted from the deeper truth. The public was conditioned to remember gore and forget responsibility. That is how myth is constructed, not by inventing lies, but by choosing which truths to emphasize and which to bury. The very families who should have been symbols of government neglect were instead turned into cautionary symbols of individual failure. And so the cycle of control continued. Every retelling reinforced obedience, follow the rules, trust the official path, or suffer their fate. This is how societies weaponize memory, turning tragedy into theater and stripping victims of their voices. Even today, when the Donner Party is mentioned, the first thought is cannibalism. Rarely does anyone ask who profited from their journey. West, who pushed them into danger, who abandoned them when the snow fell. The myth worked exactly as designed. The Donner Party became folklore, but not truth. Their bones nourished not just desperate survivors, but an empire that needed obedient settlers and unquestioning faith in its manifest destiny. That is the true cannibalism at the heart of this story. The system consuming its people, then feeding their hollowed-out images back to the masses as propaganda. The mountain did not kill them alone, the nation did. And then it rewrote the evidence. The Donner Party was more than a tragedy, was a blueprint. What happened in those mountains became a lesson for power itself, a demonstration of how fear could be sharpened into a weapon and memory turned into a cage. Authorities studied the public's reaction, realizing that cannibalism, the most taboo of human acts, could be used as a psychological chain. The mere whisper of it inspired horror, strong enough to paralyze reason. That horror could be harnessed. The wilderness became not just a landscape of snow and stone, but a symbol of disobedience, of what happens when men leave the safety of sanctioned routes and challenge authority. By magnifying the Donner story, the government and its storytellers discovered how to enforce obedience without laws. Fear of starvation, fear of exile, fear of shame they became invisible shackles binding generations of pioneers. Even those who never set foot in the Sierra Nevadas carried the shadow of the Donnas in their minds, a warning that survival lay in obedience, and death waited for those who strayed. This is how propaganda operates. It does not only shape how men think, but how they feel, how they fear, how they dream. The Donnas were consumed not once, but twice. First by their fellow travelers, desperate for survival, and second by the machinery of power, which devoured their story and regarded it as a parable of punishment. It is no accident that their tragedy was preserved while countless other stories of betrayal and abandonment were forgotten. This one was useful. It was the perfect mirror of the state's strategy: create scarcity, drive men to desperation, then shame them for the acts that desperation demands. The Donnas became the eternal reminder of what happens when one steps outside the sanctioned order. And in that reminder, generations of settlers learned obedience without needing chains. The true cannibalism was systemic, the state feeding on its people, then feeding their memory back to the masses, stripped of truth and heavy with terror. The Donna Party's story does not end in the 1840s, because its lesson was never about the snow. It was about control, about how easily men can be remade into obedient creatures when pushed into the right conditions. Look around you now. The wilderness is gone, but the system has built new mountains. Scarcity is engineered through collapsing economies, through wages that cannot feed a family, through shelves that empty while vaults overflow. Fear is manufactured by headlines that echo every hour, warning of disasters you cannot escape without. Obedience. Shame is weaponized through social structures that brand men with failure if they refuse to follow the narrow road laid before them. The Donnas faced snow and silence. You face screens and systems, but the effect is the same. The unthinkable becomes acceptable. You accept surveillance for safety. You accept lies for stability. You accept decay for survival. And just as the Donnas were shamed into silence, so too are you shamed into compliance, mocked for questioning, branded paranoid for doubting. The dark history of the Donna Party is not a relic, it is a mirror. It shows how fear, hunger, and shame can be used to consume human will until a man no longer belongs to himself. They tell us the Donnas ate their dead, but the deeper truth is that the system fed on their souls, and it is still feeding today. Now the question turns to you. Do you see it? Do you hear the echoes in your own life? The wilderness never left it, just changed form. And like those trapped families in the Sierra, you are being tested. Will you consume the lies, or will you break the cycle? If you have seen the truth hidden in this story, let it mark you. Like, share, and subscribe, not for entertainment, but because this is knowledge men were never meant to have. Spread it, and you weaken the system's chains. Leave your mark below. Declare that you are awake, that you refuse to be consumed. The Donna's silence preserved the lie. Your voice can expose it. Remember, the mountains are still here, but so are you.